The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of Bagram Airfield like a knife through bone. Major Kestrel Ghost Thorne was 3 sips into her fourth cup of coffee when the emergency frequency erupted with panic-laced voices from the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. The transmission was broken, fragmented by terrain and desperation, but the message was crystal clear. American forces were pinned down, taking heavy casualties and running out of time. Broken arrow, came the strained voice of Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez. This is Neptune 6. We have multiple KIA, critically wounded, and approximately 60 Taliban fighters in hardened positions, requesting immediate close air support. The transmission dissolved into white noise, then returned with haunting clarity. Weather's gone to shit up here. Zero visibility. Command says it's too dark to fly. Ghost set down her coffee with deliberate calm, her weathered hands steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. At 34, she had logged over 2,800 combat hours in the A-10 Thunderbolt II, earning her callsign not from any ghostly appearance, but from her uncanny ability to appear from nowhere when ground forces needed her most. The other pilots called her aircraft the Reaper, a fitting name for the tank-killing machine that had become synonymous with salvation for countless infantry units across 3 deployments. But tonight was different. The mountain weather had rolled in faster than forecast, creating a deadly cocktail of low-hanging clouds, driving snow, and visibility measured in mere yards rather than miles. The tower had already grounded all rotary-wing aircraft, and the fast movers were stuck waiting for the storm to pass. Standard operating procedure dictated that close air support missions in these conditions were suicide runs, a guaranteed way to turn one emergency into 2. Ghost stood slowly, her flight suit rustling in the operations tent as she moved toward the duty officer's station. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb looked up from his weather reports with the expression of a man carrying the weight of impossible decisions. His eyes found hers, and in that moment, she saw something that had become all too familiar in her career. The assumption that she would step back, defer to someone else, wait for conditions to improve like any reasonable pilot would. "Ma'am, respectfully, the weather," Webb began. "I've heard the weather report," Ghost interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned every word. "I've also heard the Neptune call. How many boys are up there?" Webb's jaw tightened. 12 SEALs, 4 Rangers, and a JTAC. They've been compromised for 6 hours. He paused, studying her face in the fluorescent light. "Ghost, I can't authorize this. The risk assessment. The risk assessment doesn't account for what I can do in an A-10, she said, already reaching for her helmet bag. "Sir, those men called for close air support. I intend to provide it." The silence that followed was pregnant with tension and unspoken history. Webb had seen pilots like Ghost before, confident to the point of recklessness, convinced of their own invincibility, until the mountains humbled them permanently. But he had also seen the gun camera footage from her previous missions, watched her thread the needle between friendly forces and enemy positions with surgical precision that bordered on the supernatural. In the A-10 community, reputation was everything, and Ghost's reputation was built on the kind of impossible saves that became legend. Outside, the wind howled across the flight line like a living thing, rattling the corrugated metal of the hangars and sending snow devils spiraling between the parked aircraft. The storm showed no signs of abating, and with each passing minute, the chances of the surrounded Americans seeing another sunrise grew dimmer. Whether reconnaissance flights had been canceled, search and rescue helicopters remained grounded. Even the unmanned drones had been recalled due to icing conditions that could bring down a predator faster than enemy fire. Ghost looked through the operations tent window at her A-10, barely visible through the blowing snow but unmistakable in its brutal, utilitarian design. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II was not a beautiful aircraft by conventional standards. It was built around its massive 13 GAU-8 Avenger cannon like a flying gun platform, armored to survive direct hits from small arms, and designed to operate from rough forward bases exactly like this one. Where other pilots saw an ungainly beast, Ghost saw poetry in motion, a machine perfectly suited to its deadly purpose. "Sir," she said, turning back to Webb, "I'm not asking for permission to be a hero. I'm asking for permission to do my job. Those men are counting on close air support, and I'm the only pilot on this base with the experience to deliver it in these conditions." Webb studied her for a long moment, recognizing the quiet confidence that separated true professionals from weekend warriors. He had flown transport missions over Iraq and knew the difference between bravado and competence. Ghost possessed something rarer than courage. She possessed the kind of calm certainty that came from absolute mastery of her craft. Her record spoke for itself. 87 combat missions without losing a single friendly force to fratricide, a safety record that was statistically impossible unless backed by extraordinary skill. The radio crackled again, Neptune 6's voice weaker now but no less desperate. Any station, this is Neptune 6 requesting immediate close air support. We have wounded that won't make it through the night. Please advise on close air support availability." The transmission ended with the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire, close enough to the radio operator that the gunshots nearly drowned out his words. Ghost was already walking toward the tent entrance when Webb finally spoke. "Maintenance crew is standing by. Your aircraft is fully armed and fueled." He paused, then added with grudging respect, "Don't make me regret this decision, Ghost." She turned back with a smile that held no warmth, only the cold promise of violence to come. "Sir, the only people who are going to regret anything tonight are the Taliban fighters stupid enough to engage American ground forces." She pulled on her helmet, the familiar weight settling onto her shoulders like an old friend returning home. "I'll bring our boys home." The pre-flight inspection should have taken 20 minutes under normal conditions, but normal had ceased to exist the moment Neptune 6 called for help. Ghost moved around her aircraft with practiced efficiency, her hands checking control surfaces, weapon systems, and engine intakes, while her mind calculated approach angles and attack runs through mountain terrain she knew by memory. The A-10's twin General Electric TF-34 engines were already warm, maintained in a state of readiness by a ground crew that understood the nature of their mission. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez, Ghost's dedicated crew chief, approached through the swirling snow with a look of professional concern etched on her weathered face. "Ma'am, hydraulic systems are green, weapons hot, and we've loaded extra flares for the approach." She paused, studying the weather with the eye of someone who had seen too many aircraft lost to conditions exactly like these. "This storm is the worst I've seen in 6 months. Visibility is down to less than a quarter mile, winds gusting to 45 knots, and the mountain peaks are completely socked in." Ghost nodded, understanding the warning implicit in Vasquez's briefing. The crew chief wasn't questioning her decision. She was simply ensuring that Ghost understood exactly what she was flying into. In the A-10 community, mutual respect between pilots and maintainers was built on honest communication and professional trust. Vasquez had prepared the aircraft to the highest possible standard. The rest was up to Ghost's skill and the violent poetry of the GAU-8 cannon. "Sergeant, I need you to understand something," Ghost said, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "If I don't come back from this mission, it won't be because of mechanical failure or poor maintenance. Your bird is perfect as always." She paused, looking up at the camouflaged fuselage that bore the scars of previous missions like badges of honor. "If those mountains take me tonight, it'll be because I pushed too hard or got too clever. That's on me, not you." Vasquez smiled grimly, recognizing the pilot's way of saying goodbye without actually saying it. "Ma'am, respectfully, you're the best stick-and-rudder aviator on this base. If anyone can thread the needle through this weather, it's you." She stepped back, rendering a crisp salute that somehow managed to convey both professional respect and personal affection. "Bring yourself home safe, Ghost. We'll be waiting with hot coffee and a warm hangar." The climb into the cockpit felt like entering a sacred space, every switch and gauge positioned exactly where Ghost's muscle memory expected to find them. The A-10's cockpit was not comfortable in any conventional sense. It was a titanium bathtub surrounded by instruments, designed to keep the pilot alive while delivering devastating firepower to ground targets. But for Ghost, sliding into the ejection seat felt like coming home after a long journey through foreign territory. Engine startup was a symphony of mechanical precision, twin turbofans spinning up to operational speed, while hydraulic systems pressurized and flight computers ran their diagnostic routines. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the airfield, but inside the cockpit, Ghost existed in a bubble of controlled violence, surrounded by the tools necessary to turn the tide of battle for 16 desperate Americans trapped in the mountains above. Tower clearance came through with reluctant authority, accompanied by weather warnings that bordered on the apocalyptic. Wind shear alerts, icing conditions, visibility restrictions, and terrain warnings painted a picture of atmospheric conditions that should have grounded any rational pilot. But rationality was a luxury that Ghost could not afford, not with Neptune 6's increasingly desperate radio calls serving as a countdown to catastrophe. The taxi to the runway gave Ghost a final opportunity to abort the mission, to key her radio and inform tower control that conditions were simply too dangerous for flight operations. It would have been the smart decision, the safe decision, the kind of risk-averse choice that kept pilots alive and careers intact. Instead, she pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar surge of the TF-34 engines responding to her commands, pulling 23,000 pounds of armored aircraft and high-explosive ordnance into the teeth of the storm. Takeoff roll in the A-10 was always an exercise in controlled violence, but tonight the crosswinds turned it into something approaching aerial combat before Ghost had even left the ground. The aircraft wanted to weathervane into the wind, requiring constant rudder inputs to maintain directional control, while the main landing gear fought for traction on the snow-covered runway. At rotate speed, Ghost pulled back on the stick and felt the A-10 reluctantly leave the ground, immediately beginning a climb rate that would have been ambitious in perfect weather and bordered on suicidal in current conditions. The transition from ground to air was like entering another world entirely. Below, the lights of Bagram Airfield disappeared almost instantly into the swirling snow, leaving Ghost alone with her instruments and the growing realization that the next hour would either cement her reputation as one of the finest close air support pilots in the Air Force or add her name to the list of aviators who died trying to save others. She had made peace with both possibilities long before she started engines. Initial climb was a test of nerve and instrument flying skills, the A-10 bucking and shuddering through layers of turbulence that felt like flying through a washing machine filled with concrete. Ghost's hands moved constantly across the controls, making minute adjustments to power settings and flight attitude, while the aircraft fought to maintain its programmed heading toward the mountains. Outside the canopy, visibility was measured in inches rather than feet, the landscape below completely obscured by dense clouds and driving precipitation. At 8,000 feet, Ghost broke through the bottom layer of clouds and found herself in a temporary pocket of relatively clear air, the stars visible overhead like scattered diamonds against black velvet. But the reprieve was temporary. Ahead, the mountain peaks disappeared into solid overcast that extended upward beyond the service ceiling of her aircraft. Threading the needle through the valleys would require flying on instruments alone, navigating by GPS coordinates and terrain-following radar, while hoping that the weather briefing had been accurate about wind patterns and icing conditions. The radio call from Neptune 6 came through clearly at altitude, desperation now replaced by the kind of calm professionalism that preceded either rescue or death. "Any station, this is Neptune 6. We have 4 urgent surgical, 2 KIA, and approximately 10 minutes before we're overrun. If close air support is inbound, we need it now. The transmission ended without the usual tactical chatter, suggesting that Master Chief Rodriguez was conserving both battery power and hope. Ghost keyed her microphone, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of salvation arriving from an unexpected direction. Neptune 6, this is Warthog 1-1. Inbound your position with 30 Mike and Maverick missiles. I need you to talk me onto target using infrared strobes. Visibility is near zero up here, but I can work with IR signatures. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Ghost to wonder if the radio had failed. But then Rodriguez's voice came back with the kind of relief that preceded either tears or laughter. Warthog 1-1, Neptune 6. Are you seriously telling me someone was crazy enough to launch in this weather? Neptune 6, Warthog 1-1, Ghost replied, beginning her descent toward the coordinates provided by the Joint Terminal Attack Controller embedded with the SEAL team. I'm telling you that the weather report was accurate, but sometimes accuracy isn't the most important consideration. Stand by for close air support and mark your positions with IR strobes. We're about to light up the mountainside. The descent through the cloud deck was like flying into the mouth of a hungry beast. Visibility dropping to zero as Ghost committed herself to instrument flight through terrain that had already claimed 2 helicopters and a C-130 during the previous month. The A-10's terrain-following radar painted a picture of jagged peaks and narrow valleys, but radar could not account for wind shear, downdrafts, or the invisible ice that could transform control surfaces into decorative fixtures in a matter of seconds. At 4,000 feet above ground level, Ghost began to see the faint signature of infrared strobes through her night vision system, tiny points of light that marked the difference between American and enemy positions. The JTAC's voice came through clearly now, professional and precise despite the desperate nature of his situation. Warthog 1-1, Tango 27. I have eyes on your position. Enemy forces are concentrated in hardened positions on the ridgeline, approximately 200 meters north of our position. Be advised, they have heavy machine guns and possible RPGs. Ghost armed her weapons systems, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that came with carrying live ordnance over a complex battlefield, where the difference between friend and enemy was measured in meters rather than miles. The GAU-8 cannon was loaded with depleted uranium rounds designed to penetrate tank armor, but tonight it would be used for a different purpose entirely, turning Taliban fighters and their fortified positions into component atoms scattered across the Afghan landscape. Tango 27, Warthog 1-1, Ghost transmitted, beginning her attack run through weather that should have made precise weapons delivery impossible. I'm going to make a low pass to identify targets, then come around for gun runs. Keep your heads down, this is going to be loud. The initial approach was an exercise in controlled flight through conditions that violated every safety protocol in the flight manual. Ghost descending through cloud and precipitation, until the mountainside materialized through her heads-up display like a three-dimensional nightmare. The Taliban positions were clearly visible through thermal imaging. Clusters of heat signatures concentrated around heavy weapons that had been systematically destroying the Americans' defensive perimeter for the better part of 6 hours. Ghost pulled the A-10 into a banking turn that brought her within 50 feet of the ridgeline, close enough to see muzzle flashes from enemy weapons and feel the aircraft shudder as small arms fire impacted the armored cockpit. But the real shock came not from enemy fire, but from the sudden realization that the weather had cleared just enough to provide visual reference points for the kind of precision attack that would be required to save the surrounded Americans without killing them in the process. The first gun run was a masterpiece of controlled violence, Ghost aligning the A-10's nose with the largest concentration of enemy fighters, and squeezing the trigger that unleashed 70 rounds per second of depleted uranium death. The GAU-8's distinctive sound, like a cosmic zipper being opened by an angry god, echoed across the mountains as high-explosive rounds transformed fortified positions into smoking craters. The muzzle flash from the cannon illuminated the entire mountainside in stark, strobing light that turned night into day for brief, terrifying moments. "Jesus Christ," came Rodriguez's voice over the radio, awe and relief mixing in equal measure. "Warthog 1-1, that was beautiful. You just took out their heavy machine gun position and about 20 fighters." He paused, probably watching secondary explosions from ammunition stores ignited by the cannon fire. "We need you to work the eastern slope now. They're trying to flank us from that direction." Ghost was already positioning for her second attack run, responding to her control inputs with the kind of precision that came from perfect harmony between pilot and machine. The eastern slope presented a more complex target array, enemy fighters scattered among rocks and vegetation rather than concentrated in fixed positions. This would require individual precision rather than area saturation, each trigger pull calculated to eliminate threats without endangering the Americans sheltering less than 100 meters away. The second gun run was poetry written in tracer rounds and high-explosive impacts, Ghost walking the GAU-8's fire across the mountainside with surgical precision, while Taliban fighters realized that their carefully planned ambush had become their tomb. The A-10's cannon could penetrate 12 inches of steel at 1,000 meters, making human flesh and improvised fortifications irrelevant considerations in the face of such overwhelming firepower. Between gun runs, Ghost could hear the tactical radio traffic from the ground, Rodriguez coordinating the defense, while his wounded teammates provided covering fire for medical evacuation attempts that had been impossible under heavy enemy fire. The tide of battle had turned decisively. The Taliban fighters now focused on survival rather than assault, their ambush positions transformed into killing fields by an aircraft that should never have been able to operate in current weather conditions. "Warthog 1-1, Tango 27, came the JTAC's voice, professional satisfaction evident despite the ongoing firefight. "Enemy forces are withdrawing to the north. We have positive identification on at least 40 enemy KIA, and the survivors appear to be breaking contact. You just saved our asses." Ghost keyed her microphone, already planning her next attack run against the fleeing Taliban fighters. "Tango 27, Warthog 1-1. The party's just getting started. I've got plenty of ammunition and a full fuel load. Let's make sure none of these bastards make it home to plan another ambush." The pursuit phase of the engagement transformed from close air support into something approaching aerial hunting, Ghost following the thermal signatures of fleeing enemy fighters as they attempted to escape through mountain passes that offered concealment from ground forces, but provided no protection from an A-10 operating with impunity in their airspace. Each gun run eliminated another cluster of Taliban fighters, the cannon fire illuminating the mountainside like deadly fireworks, while high-explosive rounds turned retreat into rout. By the time Ghost had expended her cannon ammunition and fired her last Maverick missile, the mountain battlefield had been transformed from a potential massacre into a decisive American victory. Neptune 6 reported negative enemy contact, all wounded stabilized for evacuation, and a casualty count that could have been catastrophic reduced to manageable proportions through the intervention of close air support delivered under impossible conditions. The flight back to Bagram was anticlimactic after the intensity of combat, Ghost nursing her battle-damaged A-10 through weather that seemed almost benign compared to the challenge of precision weapons delivery in zero-visibility conditions. The aircraft had taken several hits from small arms fire, but the titanium bathtub that surrounded the cockpit had performed as designed, protecting both pilot and critical flight systems from damage that would have been fatal in a less robust airframe. Landing approach was complicated by crosswinds and reduced visibility, but after threading the needle through mountain valleys while engaging enemy forces, a simple instrument approach felt like routine training rather than a life-threatening challenge. Ghost touched down on Bagram's main runway with the kind of gentle precision that marked her as a true professional. The A-10's main landing gear kissing the pavement with barely a chirp from the tires. The post-flight debrief would take hours. Intelligence officers eager to extract every detail of the engagement for analysis and after-action reports that would eventually work their way up the chain of command to Pentagon offices, where staff officers tried to understand combat through PowerPoint presentations and statistical analysis. But for now, Ghost was content to sit in her cockpit for a few extra moments, feeling the engines wind down while the reality of survival settled over her like a comfortable blanket. Staff Sergeant Vasquez was waiting on the flight line as Ghost shut down engines, her expression mixing professional relief with personal affection as she watched her pilot emerge from an aircraft that bore fresh scars from the night's engagement. The crew chief's inspection would reveal bullet holes in non-critical areas, testimony to the violence that had been delivered and received during the mission, but nothing that could not be repaired by morning. "Ma'am," Vasquez said, approaching with a thermos of coffee that steamed in the cold mountain air, "how was the flying tonight?" Ghost accepted the coffee with hands that were finally beginning to shake as adrenaline worked its way out of her system, the physiological aftermath of combat that every pilot learned to manage. "Sergeant, it was a beautiful night for close air support. Clear skies, perfect visibility, and targets that couldn't wait to meet their maker." She smiled, understanding that Vasquez would appreciate the irony of describing the worst flying weather in months as perfect conditions. The crew chief laughed, recognizing the pilot's way of processing combat stress through dark humor and professional understatement. "Yes, ma'am, I could see that from the bullet holes." She paused, studying Ghost's face in the hangar lights. "The ground team called on the radio while you were inbound. They wanted me to pass along a message." Ghost raised an eyebrow, curious about what Neptune 6 might have wanted to communicate through unofficial channels rather than the formal debrief process that would consume the rest of the night. "What did they say?" Vasquez smiled with the kind of genuine warmth that transcended military protocol and professional relationships. "Master Chief Rodriguez said to tell you that 16 American warriors are going home to their families tonight because one pilot was too stubborn to let weather stop her from doing her job." She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle between them. "He also said that anytime you need anything, anything at all, Neptune 6 will be there." Ghost nodded, understanding that such promises from special operations personnel represented a level of professional respect that could not be purchased with rank or political connections. In the brotherhood of combat arms, reputation was earned through actions rather than words, and tonight's mission had apparently passed whatever test the SEALs and Rangers used to separate true warriors from weekend pretenders. The walk back to the operations tent felt different now, Ghost moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the quiet satisfaction that came from a job completed successfully under impossible conditions. Behind her, Staff Sergeant Vasquez began the process of inspecting and repairing battle damage, preparing the A-10 for whatever mission might come with the rising sun. Ahead, Lieutenant Colonel Webb waited with the kind of expression that suggested both relief and profound respect for what had been accomplished. "Ghost," Webb said as she approached, his voice carrying formal authority mixed with personal admiration. "I just got off the phone with CENTCOM. They want a full debrief, gun camera footage, and a complete after-action report. But before we get into all that official business, I wanted to say something off the record." Ghost paused, recognizing the tone that preceded either commendation or court-martial, though given the successful outcome of the mission, she was reasonably confident about which direction the conversation would take. "What's that, sir?" Webb smiled with the kind of genuine respect that could not be faked or manufactured through military courtesy. "I've been in combat aviation for 22 years, and I have never seen a more professional demonstration of close air support under adverse conditions. What you did tonight will become legend in the A-10 community, and rightfully so." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and I'm personally ensuring that every pilot on this base understands exactly what happened out there." Ghost nodded, accepting the praise with the kind of quiet professionalism that had defined her entire career. Awards and decorations were secondary considerations compared to the knowledge that 16 Americans would be returning home because she had been willing to fly when conventional wisdom dictated that flight was impossible. That was the only measure of success that truly mattered in her estimation. The debriefing process stretched into the early morning hours, intelligence officers and mission planners extracting every detail of the engagement for analysis and future planning. Ghost walked them through each phase of the mission with clinical precision, her memory enhanced by gun camera footage that captured the entire engagement in stark, black and white imagery that would eventually become required viewing for close air support training programs. But the most important part of the debrief came not from official channels, but from a secure satellite phone call that connected her directly to Master Chief Rodriguez, now safely evacuated to a forward operating base, where Navy corpsmen worked to stabilize his wounded teammates. His voice carried the kind of gratitude that transcended military protocol and professional relationships. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice slightly hoarse from hours of tactical radio communication under combat conditions, "I need you to understand something. My boys have been in some serious shit over the years, and we've been saved by close air support more times than I can count. But what you did tonight, flying in weather that had every other pilot grounded, that was something special." Ghost listened quietly, understanding that such acknowledgement from special operations personnel represented the highest form of professional recognition available in her chosen field. "Master Chief, I was just doing my job. You called for close air support and I provided it." Rodriguez laughed, the sound carrying clearly despite the static-filled satellite connection. "Ma'am, respectfully, that's bullshit and you know it. You flew through weather that should have killed you to save 16 Americans you'd never met, and you did it with the kind of precision that made it look easy." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've worked with a lot of pilots over the years, and most of them are good people trying to do their best. But you're something different. You're the kind of warrior that makes the rest of us want to be better at our jobs." The conversation ended with mutual expressions of professional respect and personal gratitude, the kind of bond that formed between warriors who had shared combat and emerged victorious through a combination of skill, courage, and circumstances that bordered on the miraculous. For Ghost, it represented validation of every choice she had made throughout her military career, confirmation that the sacrifices and challenges had been worthwhile. As the sun rose over the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson that made the previous night's violence seem almost impossible, Ghost finally made her way to her quarters for the kind of exhausted sleep that followed successful combat missions. Outside her window, the flight line bustled with activity as maintainers prepared aircraft for the day's missions, the cycle of combat operations continuing with the relentless precision of a well-oiled machine. But for the 16 Americans of Neptune 6, now safely evacuated and receiving medical treatment at secure facilities, the night's events would become the kind of war story that would be told and retold for decades to come. They had called for help in conditions that made rescue impossible, and help had arrived in the form of an A-10 pilot who refused to accept the limitations imposed by weather, terrain, and conventional wisdom. In the months and years that followed, the story of Ghost's mission would become legend in military aviation circles, studied in war colleges and flight schools as an example of what could be accomplished when technical skill combined with moral courage to create something approaching the miraculous. But for those who had been there, the Americans trapped on that mountainside and the pilot who flew through hell to save them, it would always be something more personal than legend. It would be proof that sometimes, when everything goes wrong and all conventional options have been exhausted, salvation can still arrive from an unexpected direction. Sometimes it takes the form of an ungainly attack aircraft flown by a pilot too stubborn to accept defeat, carrying enough firepower to turn the tide of battle and enough skill to deliver it precisely where it was needed most. The mountains of Afghanistan had claimed many aircraft and aircrew over the years, but on this particular night, they had been forced to yield to the superior combination of American technology and warrior spirit. The SEALs had said it was too dark to fly, but Ghost's A-10 cannons had lit up the hillside anyway, transforming darkness into salvation through the application of precisely delivered violence. In the end, that was what close air support was all about, being there when ground forces needed help, regardless of conditions or circumstances that made the mission seem impossible. Ghost had built her reputation on exactly that principle, and tonight's mission had simply added another chapter to a career defined by the willingness to fly when others could not, fight when others would not, and succeed when conventional wisdom suggested that success was impossible. The legend of Ghost would continue to grow with each retelling, but for now, she was content to sleep the dreamless sleep of the righteous warrior, secure in the knowledge that 16 American families would not be receiving folded flags and expressions of official condolence. Sometimes, that was all the victory a combat pilot could ask for. As the Afghan sun climbed higher into a sky that was now clear and blue, revealing the beauty that had been hidden by the previous night's storm, the scars of battle remained visible on the mountainside where Taliban fighters had learned too late that American forces were never truly alone. Even in the darkest conditions, even when conventional wisdom dictated that help was impossible, there would always be warriors like Ghost willing to fly into the teeth of the storm and deliver salvation, with precision and overwhelming firepower. The radio frequencies fell silent as day shift operations replaced the night's emergency scrambles, but the echoes of Ghost's mission would resonate through the global war on terror for years to come. In ready rooms and operations centers around the world, pilots would hear the story and understand that they had inherited not just aircraft and weapons, but a legacy of service that transcended personal safety and conventional limitations. The mountains stood unchanged, eternal and indifferent to human conflict, but they now bore witness to another chapter in the long history of American military aviation. The night when weather reports and common sense yielded to determination and skill, when 16 lives were saved by one pilot's refusal to accept that rescue was impossible. For Master Chief Rodriguez and his team, now recovering in air-conditioned medical facilities far from the violence of combat, the memory of salvation arriving from the storm-darkened sky would remain vivid for the rest of their lives. They had called for help in their darkest hour, and it had arrived in the form of an A-10 Warthog flown by a pilot who understood that some missions transcended the normal calculations of risk and reward. The official after-action reports would focus on technical aspects of the mission, weapons expenditure, target damage assessment, and procedural compliance. But the real story was simpler and more profound. When American warriors were in trouble, other American warriors answered the call, regardless of conditions that would have deterred lesser souls. Ghost's legend was secure, her place in military aviation history guaranteed by a single night's work that exemplified everything the close air support mission was meant to achieve. But legends, like all stories worth telling, began with ordinary people making extraordinary choices when circumstances demanded nothing less than their absolute best. The SEALs had said it was too dark to fly, but sometimes darkness was exactly what the mission required: darkness to hide an approach, darkness to conceal an aircraft until the moment when cannon fire turned night into day, darkness that yielded to the brilliant flash of precisely delivered justice. In the end, Ghost had not conquered the storm so much as she had used it, turning adverse conditions into tactical advantages through the kind of airmanship that separated legends from footnotes. The war would continue, new missions would arise, and other pilots would face their own moments of truth when duty called them to exceed their limitations. But for now, the story was complete. 16 American warriors lived to fight another day because one pilot had refused to let weather determine the outcome of battle. The mountains of Afghanistan had tested Ghost and found her worthy, adding her name to the long roll of aviators who had proven that determination and skill could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The SEALs had said it was too dark to fly, but her A-10's cannons had lit the hillside anyway, illuminating not just enemy positions, but the enduring truth that American forces would never abandon their own, no matter how dark the night might become.